Sarah Mitchell had always been proud of her backyard pool. After years of saving money from her job as a nurse, she finally had enough to install the beautiful blue oasis she had dreamed about since childhood. The pool wasn't huge, but it was perfect for her small family. Her 10-year-old daughter Emma loved swimming after school, and her husband Mark enjoyed relaxing by the water after long days at the construction site. The Mitchells lived in a quiet neighborhood called Maple Grove, where most families knew each other and children played together in the streets. Sarah thought she had picked the perfect spot for their new home. The house next door belonged to the Johnsons, a family with 3 teenage boys who seemed nice enough when they first moved in 2 years ago. Everything changed on a hot Tuesday morning in July. Sarah was getting ready for her afternoon shift at the hospital when she heard loud splashing and laughter coming from her backyard. She looked out the kitchen window and couldn't believe what she saw. The 3 Johnson boys were in her pool, diving and playing as if they owned it. They had climbed over the fence and made themselves completely at home. Sarah rushed outside, still wearing her scrubs. "Excuse me," she called out, trying to keep her voice calm. "What are you doing in my pool?" The oldest boy, who looked about 17, just shrugged and said, "It's hot outside. We're just cooling off. No big deal." His younger brothers laughed and continued splashing around, completely ignoring Sarah's obvious discomfort. She explained that this was private property and asked them to leave immediately. The boys took their time getting out, making jokes about how uptight she was being. "It's just water," one of them said. "You're not even using it right now." Sarah felt her face getting red with anger, but she kept her composure. She watched them climb back over the fence, leaving wet footprints all over her pool deck. That evening, Sarah told Mark what had happened. He was furious and wanted to march over to the Johnson house right away. "They can't just use our pool whenever they want," he said. "We need to talk to their parents." Sarah agreed, but she wanted to handle it diplomatically. They were neighbors, after all, and she hoped it was just a misunderstanding. The next morning, Sarah knocked on the Johnsons' front door. Mrs. Johnson answered, and Sarah politely explained what had happened. She expected an apology and assurance that it wouldn't happen again. Instead, Mrs. Johnson became defensive. "Boys will be boys," she said with a dismissive wave. "It's summer, and they need somewhere to cool off. You should be more neighborly." Sarah was shocked by the response. She tried to explain that she had no problem with the boys asking permission first, but sneaking into someone's yard was not acceptable. Mrs. Johnson rolled her eyes and said, "You act like it's such a big deal. It's just a pool. You rich people are so selfish with your things." Walking back to her house, Sarah felt a mix of anger and disbelief. She and Mark were far from rich. They had worked hard and saved every penny for that pool. The idea that she was being selfish for wanting privacy in her own backyard was absurd. She decided to give the family one more chance and hoped the conversation would make a difference. Unfortunately, it didn't. The very next day, Sarah came home from grocery shopping to find all 3 boys in her pool again. This time, they had brought friends. There were now 6 teenagers in her pool, and they had moved her outdoor furniture around to make themselves more comfortable. Empty soda cans and chip bags were scattered around the pool deck. When Sarah asked them to leave, they barely looked at her. Mrs. Johnson said it was okay. One of the boys lied smoothly. She said you wouldn't mind sharing. Sarah knew this wasn't true, but the boys acted like they belonged there. They had even brought their own towels and were using her pool chairs like it was a public swimming facility. This time, Sarah didn't stay calm. She told them they had exactly 5 minutes to get out and clean up their mess, or she would call the police. The boys laughed and said she was being dramatic, but they eventually left, taking their trash with them. Sarah noticed they had left the gate to her backyard wide open, as if they planned to come back whenever they pleased. That night, Sarah barely slept. She kept thinking about how violated she felt. This was her home, her sanctuary, and these teenagers were treating it like their personal playground. Mark suggested they install a higher fence or maybe security cameras, but Sarah knew this was about more than just keeping people out. It was about respect, and clearly, the Johnson family had none for their neighbors. The situation got worse over the next 2 weeks. The Johnson boys had apparently decided that Sarah's pool was now their summer hangout spot. They showed up almost every day, sometimes bringing different friends from around the neighborhood. Sarah tried locking the gate, but they simply climbed over the fence like it was nothing. One afternoon, Sarah was working in her garden when she heard a loud crash from the pool area. She rushed over to find that one of the boys had knocked over her expensive ceramic planter while doing a running jump into the pool. The planter was completely destroyed, and dirt was scattered everywhere. When she confronted the boy about it, he just shrugged and said, "Accidents happen." Sarah demanded that his parents pay for the broken planter, but when she went to the Johnson house, Mr. Johnson answered the door this time. He was even less helpful than his wife. "Look, lady," he said in an aggressive tone, "kids break things. That's what insurance is for. Besides, if you didn't want things broken, maybe you shouldn't have put a planter so close to the pool." The conversation escalated quickly. Mr. Johnson accused Sarah of being a troublemaker who was trying to ruin his boys' summer fun. He said other neighbors had complained about her being unfriendly and stuck up. Sarah was stunned. She had always gotten along well with her neighbors and had never heard any complaints before. When Sarah asked which neighbors had said these things, Mr. Johnson became vague and hostile. "Everyone knows you think you're better than the rest of us," he said. "Just because you have a fancy pool doesn't mean you can tell our kids where they can and can't swim." He slammed the door in Sarah's face, leaving her standing on his porch in complete disbelief. That weekend, things reached a new low. Sarah and her family had planned a small pool party for Emma's birthday. They had invited Emma's friends from school and bought decorations, cake, and party favors. Sarah had been looking forward to this day for weeks, knowing how excited Emma was to celebrate with her friends in their own backyard. On Saturday morning, Sarah was setting up the decorations when the Johnson boys arrived with an even bigger group of friends. There were now 8 teenagers in her pool, and they were being louder and more disruptive than ever. They were playing music from a portable speaker and had brought inflatable toys that took up most of the pool space. Sarah approached them and explained that she had a children's birthday party planned for that afternoon. She asked them politely to please find somewhere else to swim for the day. The oldest Johnson boy laughed and said, "First come, first served. We were here first." His friends found this hilarious and started chanting, "First come, first served." When Sarah insisted that it was her pool and her daughter's birthday, one of the other boys said, "Then you should have asked us permission to use your own pool." The group erupted in laughter again, clearly enjoying the power they felt they had over the adult homeowner. Sarah felt tears of frustration building up, but she refused to cry in front of these disrespectful teenagers. She went inside and called Mark, who was picking up the birthday cake. When she told him what was happening, he was furious. "I'm coming home right now," he said. "This ends today." But by the time Mark arrived, the situation had gotten even worse. The teenagers had not only refused to leave, but they had also invited more friends. There were now 12 people in and around Sarah's pool. They had pushed her party decorations aside and were using the space like it was their own private club. Mark was angrier than Sarah had ever seen him. He marched out to the pool and told everyone to get out immediately. Some of the kids didn't even know who he was and asked why they had to listen to him. When Mark explained that this was his house and his pool, several of them became argumentative. The oldest Johnson boy stood up to Mark and said, "You can't make us leave. This is a free country." Mark, who was much bigger than any of the teenagers, stepped forward and said in a very serious voice, "Watch me." The tone in his voice must have gotten through to them because they finally started gathering their things. As they were leaving, one of the boys deliberately kicked over Emma's birthday decorations. Another one accidentally knocked the birthday cake off the table as he walked by. Sarah watched in horror as Emma's special day was being ruined by these thoughtless teenagers, who seemed to enjoy causing pain to others. Emma, who had been watching from the kitchen window, started crying. Her friends were arriving soon, and now there was cake smashed all over the pool deck and decorations scattered in the water. Sarah felt a rage building inside her that she had never experienced before. These people had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. After the birthday party disaster, Sarah knew she had to take serious action. Mark wanted to call the police immediately, but Sarah had a different idea. She spent the weekend researching local laws about property rights and trespassing. She also made phone calls to find out exactly what her legal options were. On Monday morning, Sarah visited the local police station. Officer Martinez listened patiently as Sarah explained the ongoing situation. He told her that technically, the teenagers were trespassing every time they entered her property without permission. However, he also explained that these cases could be complicated when neighbors were involved. The best thing to do is document everything, Officer Martinez advised. Take photos, write down dates and times, and try to get video evidence if possible. If they continue to trespass after receiving an official warning, we can take stronger action. He also suggested that Sarah might want to consider installing security cameras around her pool area. That afternoon, Sarah went to an electronics store and bought 2 small security cameras. She spent the evening learning how to set them up and connect them to an app on her phone. Mark helped her position the cameras so they would capture anyone entering the pool area. Sarah felt like she was preparing for war, but she was determined to protect her family's right to enjoy their own backyard. The cameras proved their worth the very next day. Sarah was at work when she got a notification on her phone that motion had been detected in her backyard. She checked the app and saw all 3 Johnson boys climbing over her fence. This time she had clear video evidence of them trespassing on her property. Sarah immediately called the non-emergency police number and reported the trespassing. Officer Martinez said he would send someone to the house to speak with the boys. Sarah also called Mark, who left his job site and headed home. For the first time since this whole situation started, Sarah felt like she had some control. When the police officer arrived at the Mitchell house, he found the Johnson boys still in the pool. They seemed surprised and a little nervous when they saw the uniform. The officer explained that they were trespassing on private property and that they needed to leave immediately. He also warned them that if they returned without permission, they could be arrested. The boys tried to argue that they had been swimming there for weeks and that Mrs. Mitchell had never really told them they couldn't. The officer pointed to the no trespassing signs that Mark had installed around the fence and explained that permission to be on someone else's property could be revoked at any time. After the police left, Sarah hoped that would be the end of it. She thought surely the boys would understand that they had pushed things too far and would find somewhere else to swim. She was wrong. The very next day, the boys were back, but this time they were more sneaky about it. Instead of climbing over the fence during the day, they waited until evening when they thought Sarah and Mark wouldn't notice. They also brought fewer friends and tried to be quieter. However, the security cameras caught everything. Sarah now had multiple videos of the boys trespassing on different days and times. When Sarah called the police again, Officer Martinez sighed. "I'll send someone over, but I have to tell you, Mrs. Mitchell, this could go on for a while. Some kids just don't learn from warnings. You might need to consider pressing charges if you really want this to stop." The idea of pressing charges against teenage neighbors made Sarah uncomfortable, but she was running out of options. These boys had shown no respect for authority, no consideration for her family, and no intention of changing their behavior. They seemed to think that they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. That evening, Sarah and Mark had a serious conversation about how far they were willing to go. Mark was ready to press charges immediately, but Sarah wanted to try one more approach first. She decided to research the Johnson family more thoroughly to understand why they felt so entitled to use other people's property. What Sarah discovered surprised her. Through neighborhood social media groups and casual conversations with other neighbors, she learned that the Johnsons had a history of boundary issues. Mrs. Peterson, who lived 2 streets over, mentioned that the Johnson boys had been caught using her trampoline without permission. Mr. Williams from down the block said they had taken tools from his garage and never returned them. It became clear that this wasn't just about Sarah's pool. The Johnson family seemed to believe that neighborhood resources should be shared whether the owners agreed or not. They had a pattern of taking what they wanted and then acting like the victims when people complained about it. Armed with this new information, Sarah realized that being diplomatic hadn't worked and probably never would work. The Johnsons didn't respect boundaries because they had never faced real consequences for crossing them. Sarah decided it was time to teach them a lesson they would never forget. She started by consulting with a lawyer who specialized in property disputes. The lawyer confirmed that Sarah had a strong case for repeated trespassing and property damage. He also mentioned something interesting about liability issues that gave Sarah an idea for her plan. Sarah's plan began to take shape after her conversation with the lawyer. He had explained something crucial about liability that most homeowners don't realize. If someone gets injured on your property, even if they're trespassing, you could potentially be held responsible for their medical bills and damages. This gave Sarah the perfect foundation for her strategy. The next morning, Sarah made several important phone calls. First, she contacted her homeowner's insurance company and explained the ongoing trespassing situation. The insurance representative was very concerned and immediately sent Sarah documentation about liability risks. They also recommended that she take immediate legal action to protect herself from potential lawsuits. Sarah's second call was to a local attorney who specialized in premises liability. During their consultation, the lawyer explained that having trespassers regularly using her pool created a significant financial risk for Sarah's family. If one of the teenagers got hurt, their parents could sue Sarah for inadequate safety measures or attractive nuisance claims. The lawyer drafted an official cease and desist letter addressed to the Johnson family. The letter outlined the legal consequences of continued trespassing and detailed the potential liability issues. It explained that any future injuries occurring on the Mitchell property could result in the Johnsons being held financially responsible for creating the dangerous situation. Armed with official legal documents, Sarah felt confident about the next phase of her plan. She hand-delivered the cease and desist letter to the Johnson house on a Thursday evening. Mrs. Johnson answered the door and read the letter with growing alarm. The legal language and mention of potential lawsuits clearly made her uncomfortable. "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Johnson said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had before. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. The boys are just swimming." Sarah calmly explained that she was simply protecting her family from legal liability, and that the boys were welcome to swim anywhere with proper permission from property owners. That weekend, Sarah implemented the second part of her plan. She contacted a pool maintenance company and scheduled them to come on Monday morning for a complete chemical treatment and safety inspection. She made sure to mention that there had been unauthorized use of the pool and that she needed to ensure proper chemical balance and safety compliance. On Sunday evening, Sarah placed temporary signs around her pool area that read, "Danger, pool under chemical treatment, no swimming until further notice, hazardous conditions." She also added signs warning about legal liability for unauthorized use during the treatment period. Monday morning arrived, and like clockwork, the Johnson boys showed up for their regular illegal swim. However, this time they found the pool surrounded by warning signs and a professional maintenance crew taking water samples and adding chemicals. The maintenance supervisor, who Sarah had briefed about the trespassing situation, immediately approached the boys. "You can't be here," the supervisor said firmly. "This pool is undergoing chemical treatment that could be dangerous. The property owner has specifically requested that all unauthorized persons stay away until the treatment is complete." The boys tried to argue, but the presence of official workers and hazard signs made them retreat. The maintenance company, as part of Sarah's arrangement, took their time with the treatment. They spent the entire day testing water, adjusting chemical levels, and documenting everything for safety compliance records. Every time the boys tried to return, they found professional workers who turned them away for safety reasons. Tuesday brought phase 3 of Sarah's plan. She had researched local pool regulations and discovered that pools over a certain size required specific safety features and regular inspections. Sarah contacted the city's building and safety department and requested an official inspection of her pool to ensure full compliance with current regulations. The city inspector arrived on Wednesday and spent several hours examining Sarah's pool area. As part of the inspection process, he noted the evidence of unauthorized use and the potential safety violations this created. He issued an official report recommending additional safety measures and posted a notice requiring a permit for any future pool modifications or intensive use. The inspection process created a paper trail that would support Sarah's legal position if the situation escalated further. More importantly, It demonstrated to the neighborhood that Sarah was taking the situation seriously and following all proper channels to resolve it. During this time, Sarah noticed that other neighbors were paying attention to what was happening. Mrs. Chen from across the street stopped by to express support for Sarah's actions. She mentioned that her own teenage son had been pressured by the Johnson boys to sneak into various yards around the neighborhood. "You're doing the right thing," Mrs. Chen said. "Someone needed to stand up to them. They think they can do whatever they want because their parents always make excuses for them." Sarah was relieved to learn that other neighbors understood her position and didn't think she was being unreasonable. By the end of the week, Sarah had successfully kept the Johnson boys out of her pool for several consecutive days. However, she knew this was just the beginning of her lesson plan. The boys and their parents needed to understand that actions have consequences and that they couldn't continue bullying their neighbors into submission. By the second week of Sarah's strategic approach, the Johnson family was starting to feel the pressure. Mr. Johnson appeared at Sarah's front door on Thursday evening, holding the cease and desist letter and looking frustrated. His usual aggressive attitude was replaced with something closer to concern. "Look, Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time since they'd been neighbors. "Don't you think you're going a little overboard with all this legal stuff? They're just kids, having fun in the summer." Sarah noticed that he was no longer calling her lady or being dismissive. The official legal documentation had clearly gotten his attention. Sarah remained calm and professional. She explained that she had tried being neighborly and talking things through, but his family had chosen to escalate the situation by continuing to trespass and damage her property. "I'm simply protecting my family from liability," she said. "If something happens to your boys on my property, we could all face serious financial consequences." The mention of financial consequences seemed to worry Mr. Johnson even more. He asked what it would take to resolve the situation. Sarah presented him with a simple solution. His boys needed to stop trespassing completely, they needed to pay for the damaged planter, and the family needed to acknowledge that they had violated her property rights. Mr. Johnson agreed to pay for the planter, but he balked at making his boys apologize. "They're proud kids," he said. "You can't expect them to grovel." Sarah explained that she wasn't asking for groveling, just basic acknowledgement that they had been wrong and assurance that it wouldn't happen again. The conversation ended without a complete resolution, but Sarah could see that Mr. Johnson was finally taking the situation seriously. The legal implications and potential financial risks had penetrated his previous attitude of entitlement. However, Sarah wasn't ready to trust that this conversation alone would solve the problem. Over the weekend, Sarah implemented the most creative part of her plan. She had researched local swimming options and discovered that the city had several public pools and splash pads. She also found information about swimming lessons and water safety programs for teenagers. On Monday morning, Sarah compiled all this information into a friendly neighborhood newsletter that she had professionally printed. The newsletter was titled, "Keeping Our Community Safe and Fun This Summer," and included sections about pool safety, liability concerns, and legal swimming alternatives in the area. Sarah distributed the newsletter to every house in a 3-block radius. The newsletter didn't mention the Johnson family specifically, but it clearly outlined the legal and safety issues related to unauthorized pool use. It also provided helpful information about where families could enjoy swimming legally and safely. The response from neighbors was overwhelmingly positive. Several people stopped by to thank Sarah for providing the information and to share their own experiences with property boundary issues. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that the Johnson boys had been using her basketball hoop without permission, while Mr. Thompson said they had been taking fruit from his apple tree. These conversations revealed that Sarah's pool wasn't an isolated incident. The Johnson boys had been testing boundaries throughout the neighborhood, taking advantage of people's politeness and reluctance to confront teenagers. Sarah realized that her actions might help other neighbors who had been too intimidated to speak up. The newsletter also served another purpose. It educated the entire neighborhood about liability issues related to pools and other property amenities. Several neighbors thanked Sarah for making them aware of risks they hadn't considered. Some even decided to review their own insurance policies and property safety measures. Meanwhile, Sarah noticed that the Johnson boys were becoming increasingly frustrated. They had been seen walking around the neighborhood more, apparently looking for alternative entertainment. On Tuesday afternoon, she observed them standing outside her fence pointing at the pool and having what appeared to be an animated discussion. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. The oldest Johnson boy, the 17-year-old, who had been the most defiant throughout the entire situation, came to her front door alone. He looked uncomfortable and kept shifting from foot to foot while he spoke. "My dad says I need to apologize," he said, clearly not happy about it. Sarah invited him to sit on her front porch and asked him to explain what he was apologizing for. At first, he gave a generic apology about using your pool, but Sarah pressed him for more specifics. Gradually, the teenager began to understand what Sarah was trying to teach him. He acknowledged that climbing over her fence was wrong, that bringing friends without permission was disrespectful, and that breaking her planter and ruining Emma's birthday party was cruel. By the end of their conversation, his apology seemed more genuine. "I guess I never thought about how it felt from your side," he admitted. "I just thought you were being mean because you didn't want us to have fun. But it's really about respect, isn't it?" Sarah nodded and told him that she appreciated his honesty and his willingness to see the situation differently. The young man also revealed something interesting. He said that his parents had been contacted by other neighbors about various issues involving him and his brothers. The newsletter had apparently prompted several people to speak up about problems they had been experiencing. The Johnson family was beginning to realize that their behavior had affected the entire neighborhood. Sarah felt like this conversation was a breakthrough, but she knew that changing the behavior of all three boys and their parents would require follow-through. The oldest boy seemed to genuinely understand what he had done wrong, but his younger brothers and his parents still needed to fully accept responsibility for their actions. The final phase of Sarah's lesson came together in an unexpected way. 2 weeks after her conversation with the oldest Johnson boy, she received a phone call from Officer Martinez. He told her that the Johnson family had been cited for several code violations following complaints from multiple neighbors. Apparently, Sarah's newsletter had encouraged other residents to report various issues they had been experiencing. The Johnsons had been storing non-working vehicles in their front yard, which violated city ordinances. They also had building code violations related to an unpermitted deck addition and landscaping issues that affected neighborhood drainage. "It seems like your situation opened up a lot of communication in your neighborhood," Officer Martinez explained. "Sometimes it takes one person standing up for their rights to help others find their voice too." Sarah felt a mix of satisfaction and sympathy. She hadn't intended to cause this cascade of problems for her neighbors, but she also recognized that these were consequences of their own choices. The cumulative effect of multiple citations, legal warnings, and neighborhood pressure finally broke through the Johnson family's stubborn attitude. Mrs. Johnson appeared at Sarah's door on a Friday evening, and for the first time since the whole situation began, she looked genuinely remorseful. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice much quieter than it had been in previous conversations. "I've been talking to other neighbors, and I'm starting to understand that this wasn't just about the pool. We've been inconsiderate, in a lot of ways." Sarah invited her in for coffee, and they had the honest conversation that should have happened months earlier. Mrs. Johnson explained that her family had been struggling financially, and the boys felt left out because they couldn't afford to join the community pool or participate in expensive summer activities. She said she had convinced herself that sharing neighborhood resources was acceptable because everyone should look out for each other. Sarah listened with empathy, but she also explained how the family's approach had been wrong. "I would have been happy to work out something reasonable if you had just asked," Sarah said. "Maybe the boys could have earned pool time by helping with yard work, or we could have arranged specific days when they were welcome. But sneaking into someone's yard and acting entitled to their property isn't the way to handle financial difficulties." The conversation led to a genuine understanding between the two mothers. Mrs. Johnson admitted that she and her husband had been setting a bad example for their sons by defending behavior they knew was wrong. She also acknowledged that they had been resentful of neighbors who seemed more financially successful, and this resentment had influenced how they justified their actions. Over the next few days, All three Johnson boys came to apologize individually. The two younger boys were clearly following their parents' instructions, but they also seemed to understand that their behavior had been wrong. The oldest boy's apology was the most meaningful, because Sarah could see that he had genuinely learned something from the experience. The boys also presented Sarah with money to pay for the broken planter and a handwritten card apologizing to Emma for ruining her birthday party. Emma, who had been watching the whole situation with the keen awareness that children often have, accepted their apology graciously and even invited them to her next birthday party if they wanted to come as actual guests. The resolution extended beyond just the pool situation. The Johnson family began addressing their various code violations and making an effort to be better neighbors. They started asking permission before using other people's property and actually became quite helpful around the neighborhood. Mr. Johnson, who had been the most hostile during the conflict, surprised everyone by offering to help elderly neighbors with yard work and home repairs. It was as if the family had needed someone to hold them accountable before they could recognize how their behavior was affecting others. Sarah's strategic approach had worked better than she had ever hoped. By using official channels, legal documentation, and community education rather than just angry confrontations, she had created lasting change. The lesson the Johnson family learned wasn't just about respecting property boundaries, but about how their actions affected an entire community. The transformation was remarkable. Within a month, the Johnson boys had become some of the most polite teenagers in the neighborhood. They started a small business doing odd jobs for neighbors, earning money to pay for legitimate recreation activities. The oldest boy even got a part-time job at the community center, where he helped maintain the public pool he and his brothers now used regularly. Mrs. Johnson joined the neighborhood association and became an advocate for creating more affordable summer programs for local families. She organized fundraisers and volunteer drives that helped several families access swimming lessons and recreational activities they couldn't afford on their own. The entire neighborhood seemed to benefit from the way Sarah had handled the situation. Property boundaries were respected, neighbors communicated more openly about problems, and there was a greater sense of community accountability. Several residents mentioned that they felt more comfortable addressing issues directly, rather than letting resentment build up. Sarah's pool became a symbol of something positive, rather than a source of conflict. She occasionally invited neighborhood children over for supervised swimming sessions, always with proper permission from parents. Emma's friends loved these pool parties, and even the Johnson boys were sometimes included as welcome guests rather than unwanted intruders. The security cameras that Sarah had installed remained in place, but they now mostly captured footage of Emma and her friends playing peacefully in the backyard. The no trespassing signs were still there, but they were no longer needed as deterrents because respect had replaced entitlement. Looking back, Sarah realized that the most important lesson had been about standing up for yourself in the right way. She could have escalated the situation with anger and hostility, potentially creating lasting enemies and making the neighborhood an unpleasant place to live. Instead, she had used patience, legal knowledge, and community support to teach a lesson that benefited everyone involved. The Johnson family never forgot the experience. Years later, when the boys had grown up and moved on to college and jobs, they would still sometimes stop by to chat with Sarah and Mark. They often thanked Sarah for teaching them about respect and accountability, lessons that had served them well in their adult lives. The neighborhood had learned something valuable too. When conflicts arise, there are ways to address them that can strengthen community bonds rather than destroy them. Sarah's approach had shown that standing firm on your principles doesn't require being cruel or vindictive. Sometimes the most effective lessons are taught through consistency, documentation, and helping people understand the broader consequences of their actions. Emma, now older and wiser, often told her friends about the summer when her mom taught the whole neighborhood about respect and boundaries. She was proud of how her mother had handled the situation and had learned valuable lessons about standing up for yourself while still treating others with dignity. The pool continued to be a source of joy for the Mitchell family, but it had also become something more significant. It represented the idea that people have the right to enjoy their property in peace, that boundaries matter in healthy communities, and that sometimes teaching someone a lesson is really about helping them become a better version of themselves.